Dearest listeners, there exists no torment quite so exquisite as watching the one you have loved since childhood choose another, particularly when that other is a creature of silk and shadows from the impure ton. Should this tale of yearning hearts move you as it has moved countless others in London's finest drawing rooms, do share your own thoughts in the comments below. And if you find yourself enchanted by these chronicles of love and scandal, a subscription ensures you shall never miss another delicious revelation from this author's pen. But pray, do click that little bell of approval if my storytelling pleases you. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most heart-rending tale of a country rose who bloomed in obscurity whilst her beloved cavorted with London's most notorious courtesan. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. In the verdant countryside of Devonshire, where morning mist clung to rolling hills like gossamer veils, stood Rosewood Manor, a respectable if modest estate that had belonged to the merchant family for 3 generations. Here, in the year of our Lord 1819, Miss Diana Rosewood had reached her 22nd year, that delicate age when a young lady's name, if not carefully managed, might begin to be pronounced with a mixture of pity and finality in society's drawing rooms. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast parlor as Diana sat before her correspondence, her delicate fingers tracing the embossed seal of a letter that had arrived with the dawn post. Her mother, Mrs. Rosewood, a woman of admirable sense despite her merchant origins, observed her daughter with the keen eye of one who had long suspected where her child's affections lay. The letter bore the crest of Westmore, a golden lion rampant upon a field of azure, and though it was addressed to Mr. Rosewood regarding matters of commerce, its very presence seemed to disturb the air around Diana like a stone cast into still waters. Miss Diana Rosewood possessed that particular beauty which blooms slowly in the countryside, away from the harsh scrutiny of London's ton. Her hair, the color of autumn chestnuts, fell in gentle waves that no amount of curling papers could entirely tame. Her eyes, a striking shade of amber that caught the light like aged brandy, held an intelligence that her governess had once declared both a blessing and a curse for a woman of her station. She had been educated beyond what was strictly necessary for a merchant's daughter, a circumstance that owed much to the proximity of Westmore Abbey and the kindness of the late Duchess, who had taken a peculiar interest in the bright-eyed child from the neighboring estate. It was this connection that had shaped the entire course of Diana's existence, for Westmore Abbey was more than merely the grandest estate in Devonshire. It was the childhood domain of Lord Thomas Montrose, heir to the Duke of Westmore and the unwitting possessor of Diana's heart since she was barely 7 years of age. The memories of those halcyon days remained crystalline in her mind, preserved like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. Thomas, 2 years her senior, had been a golden child in every sense, his hair catching sunlight like spun gold, his eyes the clear blue of summer skies, his laugh ringing through the orchards where they had played at knights and dragons. The late Duchess, finding her son lonely despite his elevated position, had encouraged the friendship between the ducal heir and the merchant's daughter, viewing it as a harmless diversion that would teach Thomas charity and kindness toward those of lower station. How little the Duchess had understood the seeds she was planting in 2 young hearts. For while Thomas had seen in Diana a delightful playmate and eventual confidant, she had given him her whole heart with the completeness that only a child can manage, a gift that had only deepened and matured with passing years. Their separation had come when Thomas reached his 15th year. Oxford beckoned, followed by the grand tour that was de rigueur for young men of his station, though somewhat delayed by the recent troubles on the continent. Diana had stood at the edge of the estate, hidden behind the ancient oak where they had once carved their initials in childish rebellion, watching his carriage disappear into the distance. He had promised to write, and for a time he had kept that promise. Letters arrived filled with descriptions of classical architecture and Renaissance art, of diplomatic soirees in Vienna and carnival celebrations in Venice. But gradually the letters had grown fewer, their tone more formal, until they ceased altogether. 7 years had passed since that day. 7 years during which Diana had refused no fewer than 3 proposals from perfectly respectable gentlemen. a prosperous cloth merchant from Bath, a widowed landowner with a modest estate in Somerset, and most recently, Mr. Hartley, the earnest young vicar whose living was in the gift of the Duke himself. Each refusal had caused her parents increasing distress, for they could not understand what their daughter sought that these worthy men could not provide. What they did not know, what Diana had never confessed to any living soul save her diary, was that each Sunday in church, each assembly in the local rooms, each picnic and card party and musical evening had been haunted by the specter of a love that refused to die despite all reason and propriety demanding its demise. She had loved Thomas Montrose with the pure heart of a child, and that love had transformed into something deeper, more complex, more impossible with each passing year. The cruel irony of her situation was not lost upon her. She, a merchant's daughter, had been educated and refined beyond her station, making her unsuitable for men of her own class who found her too accomplished, whilst remaining impossibly beneath the notice of the only man she desired. She existed in a social limbo, neither fish nor fowl, as her old governess might have said. Mr. Rosewood, upon opening the letter at breakfast, announced with considerable pleasure that the Duke of Westmore requested his expertise in modernizing the estate's agricultural practices, a commission that would require frequent visits to the Abbey over the coming months. The transformation in his daughter's countenance did not escape his notice, though he attributed it to general excitement rather than its true cause. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought that would change everything, that Lord Thomas had returned from London for an extended stay, having tired of the season's festivities. 3 days hence, when Mr. Rosewood made his first visit to Westmore Abbey, propriety demanded that his wife and daughter accompany him to pay their respects to the Duke. Diana dressed with particular care that morning, selecting a morning gown of soft dove gray that complemented her coloring without appearing to put herself forward. Her hands trembled as her maid arranged her hair in a simple but becoming style, and she found herself unable to eat even a morsel of breakfast, her stomach churning with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The approach to Westmore Abbey had never seemed longer. The avenue of lime trees, planted by the third Duke a century past, created a natural cathedral of green that filtered the morning light into dancing patterns across their carriage. Each hoofbeat of the horses seemed to echo in Diana's chest, marking time toward a moment she had both yearned for and dreaded. Her mother, seated beside her, maintained a steady stream of inconsequential chatter about the weather and the prospects for the harvest. But Diana heard none of it, her entire being focused on what lay ahead. The Abbey itself stood in all its Palladian splendor, its honey-colored stone warm in the morning sun, its windows reflecting the cloudless sky like eyes full of secrets. Footmen in the Westmore livery stood ready to assist them from the carriage, their faces masks of professional indifference that gave no hint of the drama about to unfold. As they were escorted through the marble entrance hall, with its soaring ceiling painted with classical scenes, Diana found herself gripping her reticule with such force that the beaded surface left impressions on her gloved palms. Portraits of previous dukes and duchesses gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge this merchant's daughter who dared to love above her station. The butler, a man of imposing dignity whose service to the family spanned 4 decades, led them to the blue drawing room where the Duke awaited them. But it was not his grace who drew Diana's attention as they entered that magnificent chamber with its silk-covered walls and priceless artwork. Standing by the window, his figure silhouetted against the morning light, stood Thomas Montrose. Time seemed to slow, crystallizing into a moment of such intensity that every detail would remain etched in her memory forever. He turned at their entrance, and Diana felt the impact of his gaze like a physical blow. The gangly youth she remembered had transformed into a man of commanding presence. His shoulders had broadened, filling out the perfectly tailored coat of navy superfine that emphasized his athletic build. The boyish softness had left his face, replaced by angular planes that spoke of maturity and experience. His golden hair, once unruly and constantly falling into his eyes, was now tamed into a fashionable Brutus cut that emphasized the classical perfection of his features. But it was his eyes that struck her most forcefully. Those same blue eyes she remembered, but now holding depths that spoke of experiences she could only imagine. There were shadows there, a world weariness that had not existed in the boy she had known. For one breathless moment, their gazes locked across the room, and Diana thought she saw a flash of recognition, of something that might have been joy or pain or both. Then, the moment shattered. Thomas's expression smoothed into one of polite indifference, and he stepped forward to greet her father with warm familiarity that spoke of their continued correspondence over the years. He paid his respects to her mother with perfect courtesy, complimenting her on her husband's business acumen and expressing pleasure at renewing their acquaintance. And when he turned to Diana, nothing. No recognition whatsoever. He bowed with the same polite distance he might have shown to any young lady of marginal acquaintance, murmuring appropriate pleasantries about hoping she found the countryside to her liking. The pain of that non-recognition was exquisite, sharp as a blade between her ribs. Had she truly changed so much in 7 years that he did not know her? Or, and this thought was worse, had she simply meant so little that he had forgotten her entirely? They were seated. Tea was served on porcelain so fine it was nearly transparent, and conversation flowed around topics of agricultural improvement and market prices. Diana sat silent, her tea cooling untouched, aware of every movement Thomas made, every gesture, every inflection of his voice. He spoke knowledgeably about new farming techniques he had observed on the continent, about innovations in crop rotation that might benefit the estate. His voice had deepened, acquiring a richness that made even discussion of turnip yields somehow compelling. It was perhaps 20 minutes into this excruciating social performance when everything changed. Thomas had been reaching for his teacup when his gaze fell upon Diana's hands, folded in her lap. She had removed her gloves upon accepting tea, as was customary, and on her right hand was a small ring, a simple band of gold with a tiny sapphire, a gift from her grandmother that she had worn since she was 16. Thomas went absolutely still, his hand frozen halfway to his cup. His eyes traveled slowly from the ring to her face, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned. The color drained from his face, then rushed back in a tide that reached even his ears. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The transformation in his manner was immediate and complete. The polite distance evaporated like morning mist before the sun. He set down his teacup with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer, drawing a disapproving glance from his father, and moved to take the seat beside her with an eagerness that would have been comical had it not made her heart race so tremendously. The name that fell from his lips was her given name, spoken with a wondering tone that suggested he could scarcely believe she sat before him. His eyes devoured her face, taking in every feature as if memorizing them anew. The careful social mask he had worn crumbled entirely, replaced by an expression of such naked emotion that Diana felt heat rise in her cheeks. Questions poured from him in a torrent that completely ignored proper conversational conventions. What had she been doing these 7 years? Had she traveled? What books had she read? Did she still ride? Did she remember the time they had tried to rescue that fox cub and hidden it in the old gamekeeper's cottage? His enthusiasm was that of the boy she remembered, barely contained within the man's more polished exterior. The Duke watched this display with increasing concern, his austere features settling into lines of disapproval. A duke's heir did not show such marked attention to a merchant's daughter, no matter how respectable the family. With the skill of long practice, His Grace redirected the conversation to business matters, effectively separating Thomas from Diana's side by requesting his opinion on a map of the estate spread across a nearby table. But Thomas was not so easily deterred. Even as he discussed drainage systems and tenant agreements with his father and Mr. Rosewood, his eyes constantly found Diana. When the business discussion concluded and it was time for the Rosewood family to depart, Thomas insisted on escorting them to their carriage, a courtesy that was not strictly necessary and earned him another sharp look from the Duke. As they walked through the entrance hall, Thomas contrived to fall into step beside Diana, speaking in a low voice meant only for her ears. He asked if she still enjoyed walking in the gardens, if she remembered the wilderness walk where they had built fairy houses as children. When she admitted that she did, he pressed her to return tomorrow, when her father came for his next consultation. There was an urgency in his manner that suggested this was more than a casual invitation. The garden walk that followed the next day would be etched in Diana's memory with the clarity of a miniature painting. Thomas was waiting for her at the entrance to the formal gardens, and the smile that illuminated his face when he saw her approach made her pulse quicken. He offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and they set off along paths lined with perfectly manicured box hedges. At first, conversation was stilted, both acutely aware of the 7-year gulf that separated them. But as they walked past familiar landmarks, the fountain where they had sailed leaf boats, the ancient yew where they had hidden from Thomas's tutor, the rose garden where Diana had pricked her finger and Thomas had torn his best handkerchief to bind it, the years began to fall away. Thomas spoke of his time at Oxford, but not in the way his letters had, full of architectural details and scholarly pursuits. Instead, he told her of the loneliness he had felt, surrounded by young men who saw him only as a future duke, never as simply Thomas. He described the grand tour as a gilded cage, moving from one European court to another, always on display, always performing the role of the perfect English nobleman. But it was when he spoke of London that an almost imperceptible crease formed between his brows and his hand, resting on the stone balustrade, clenched into a tense fist. The glittering society that had seemed so alluring from a distance had proved hollow upon closer acquaintance. He described a world where every word was calculated, every gesture performed for effect, where genuine emotion was viewed with suspicion and sincerity considered gauche. The gaming hells of St. James's, the elaborate masquerades, the endless round of balls and routs, all of it had left him feeling empty, searching for something real in a world of beautiful facades. As he spoke, Diana began to understand that the shadows in his eyes were not just weariness, but a kind of disillusionment. The boy who had believed in heroes and happy endings had been forced to see the world as it truly was, and the knowledge had marked him. Yet there was something else, something he did not speak of directly, but which hung between them like smoke. References to certain establishments in Covent Garden, a slight flinch when she mentioned the opera, the way he changed the subject when she asked about his plans to return to London, all suggested secrets that politeness forbade him from sharing with an unmarried lady. Their walks became a regular occurrence over the following weeks. Mr. Rosewood's commission required thrice weekly visits to the Abbey, and Thomas contrived to be present for each one. What had begun as garden walks progressed to rides through the estate, for Thomas discovered that Diana had become an accomplished horsewoman in his absence. These rides afforded them a freedom of conversation impossible in more formal settings. With only a groom trailing at a respectful distance, they could speak more openly. Thomas treated her not as a merchant's daughter to whom he was condescending to be kind, but as an equal, a friend whose opinion he valued and whose company he genuinely sought. They discussed poetry. He was surprised to find she had read Byron despite the scandal, and even more surprised by her thoughtful critique of the poet's work. She argued that beneath the romantic excess lay a profound understanding of human nature's darker aspects, an observation that made Thomas look at her with something approaching awe. They debated politics, with Diana showing a grasp of economic theory that would have shocked most men of Thomas's acquaintance. Her understanding of her father's business had given her insights into trade and finance that Thomas found fascinating. During one particularly memorable ride, they stopped at a tenant farm where the family was struggling with a sick child. Diana immediately dismounted and entered the cottage, ignoring Thomas's protests about propriety. She examined the child with gentle efficiency, prescribed a simple remedy her mother used for fever, and promised to send additional supplies from Rosewood Manor. Thomas watched in amazement as this elegant young woman knelt on the dirt floor beside the child's pallet, showing no concern for her expensive riding habit. It was in moments like these that Thomas seemed to truly see her, not as the little girl he had played with, not as a pretty face at local assemblies, but as a woman of substance and character. The way he looked at her began to change, the friendly warmth deepening into something more intense, more dangerous. Yet for all the joy these meetings brought, Diana was not insensible to the impropriety of their renewed acquaintance. Society had strict rules about the interaction between unmarried men and women, particularly when they belonged to such different social spheres. The presence of a groom provided only the barest veneer of propriety, and tongues were beginning to wag in the neighborhood. Mrs. Fairfax, the squire's wife and the acknowledged leader of local society, had already made several pointed remarks about the importance of knowing one's place. At the monthly card party she hosted, she had spent an entire evening making veiled comments about ambitious young women who forgot their station, all while staring directly at Diana. The vicar's sister, Miss Hartley, who harbored hopes of her brother's success with Diana, now looked at her with barely concealed hostility. Even the shopkeepers in the village showed a new curiosity when she appeared, their eyes following her with speculation. Thomas seemed oblivious to these undercurrents, or perhaps he simply did not care. His entire demeanor during this period was that of a man who had been drowning and suddenly found himself able to breathe again. The shadows that had haunted his eyes upon his return gradually began to recede, and something of the boy Diana had known re-emerged in the man's genuine laughter and enthusiastic manner. It was during the third week of this dangerous dance that fate intervened in the form of an unexpected visitor. Diana had just returned from a morning ride with Thomas, her cheeks flushed with exercise and happiness, when she encountered a traveling chaise of exceptional elegance drawn up before the main entrance of Westmore Abbey. The arms on the door were unfamiliar, but the postillion's livery suggested someone of considerable importance. A flash of something, abject dread, passed through Thomas's eyes before being shuttered, and his bearing, which had been relaxed in her company, became instantly rigid. He attempted to direct Diana toward the side entrance, but it was too late. From the chaise descended a vision of sophisticated beauty that made every other woman Diana had ever seen appear provincial by comparison. This creature, for surely she was too perfect to be merely human, stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with raven black hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid hours to achieve. Her traveling dress of emerald green silk was cut in the very latest fashion, daringly low across the bosom and clinging to a figure that managed to be both voluptuous and elegant. Her face was a perfect oval, with features so regular they might have been carved by a master sculptor, and her complexion had that porcelain perfection that suggested she had never experienced a moment's discomfort in her life. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, dark, knowing eyes that held secrets and promises in equal measure, and a glint of steel that spoke of a woman who, without the shield of birth, had been forced to fight for every inch of her place in the world and had no intention of yielding it. This magnificent creature's gaze swept over Thomas with proprietary satisfaction before settling on Diana with the kind of assessment one might give to a minor inconvenience: brief, dismissive, and ultimately unimportant. The slight curve of her perfectly rouged lips suggested amusement at finding the heir to Westmore in company with what she clearly perceived as a country nobody. The lady addressed Thomas in a voice like aged whiskey, smooth and intoxicating with just a hint of danger. She expressed her delight at accepting the Duke's invitation to visit, having grown so terribly bored in London without her particular friend to entertain her. The emphasis she placed on particular friend left no doubt as to the nature of their acquaintance, though it was couched in language that maintained a paper-thin veneer of propriety. Thomas performed the introductions with visible reluctance. The lady was Mrs. Lydia Carrington, a wealthy widow whose husband had conveniently expired 2 years prior, leaving her with a fortune in government consols acquired during the war and lucrative canal shares. She extended 2 fingers to Diana in the manner of one conferring a great favor, her smile never reaching those calculating eyes. The encounter lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but it was sufficient to shatter every illusion Diana had been harboring about the nature of Thomas's regard for her. The way Mrs. Carrington touched his arm with casual intimacy, the way she referred to shared experiences in London using veiled language that nonetheless made their meaning clear, the way Thomas could not quite meet Diana's eyes, all of it painted a picture that required no further elaboration. Diana excused herself with what dignity she could muster, claiming a forgotten appointment with her mother. Thomas made as if to escort her to her carriage, but Mrs. Carrington's light laugh and reminder of his promise to show her the portrait gallery effectively tethered him to her side. He could only bow as Diana departed, his eyes conveying a misery that might have been gratifying had her own heart not been bleeding quite so profusely. 3 days passed before Diana saw Thomas again. 3 days during which she maintained a cheerful facade that fooled no one, least of all her mother. Mrs. Rosewood, with the wisdom of one who had also loved where prudence dictated against it, did not press her daughter for confidences, but simply ensured that she was never alone long enough for her thoughts to consume her entirely. It was the evening of the Midsummer Assembly, an annual event that brought together all the respectable families of the neighborhood, when fate intervened once more. Diana had initially refused to attend, but her father, concerned by her pallor and unusual quietness, had insisted that the family make an appearance. She wore her finest evening dress, a confection of cream muslin embroidered with tiny gold flowers that had been her come-out dress 2 years prior, carefully maintained for special occasions. The assembly rooms were crowded and overwarm, filled with the same faces she had known all her life. Mr. Hartley immediately solicited her hand for the first dance, which she could not refuse without giving offense. As they moved through the patterns of the country dance, Diana caught herself searching the room for a golden head that towered above the crowd, hating herself for the weakness even as she continued to look. He arrived as the second dance was forming, and his entrance caused a palpable ripple through the assembled company. Lord Thomas Montrose did not attend local assemblies. It was understood that the heir to a dukedom had more elevated entertainments at his disposal. Yet here he was, resplendent in evening dress, and most remarkably, alone. His eyes found hers across the crowded room with unerring accuracy. When the dance ended, he was there, bowing formally and requesting the honor of the next dance. The cotillion began, and for a time, the familiar patterns provided structure. But when the dance brought them together for the promenade, Thomas spoke in a low, urgent voice that only she could hear. He told her that Mrs. Carrington had departed that morning, her visit cut short by urgent business in London. He said that he had told Mrs. Carrington not to return, that whatever had existed between them in London was finished. When Diana remained silent, he added with raw honesty that he had been a fool in London, seeking to fill an emptiness he had not understood with pleasures that had only deepened it. Seeing her again had been like awakening from a laudanum dream to find reality more beautiful than any fantasy. The dance ended, but Thomas did not immediately release her hand. During the supper interval, he appeared at her side once more, suggesting a turn on the terrace to escape the suffocating heat. Mrs. Rosewood, after a long look at the young lord's face, gave her permission with a small nod, but positioned herself strategically near the open terrace doors, maintaining them discreetly under her watchful gaze. On the moonlit terrace, surrounded by climbing roses heavy with blooms, Thomas opened his heart completely. He spoke of the boy who had been sent away from everything he loved, thrust into a world where his title mattered more than his character. He told her how shame had gradually silenced his letters as he realized how far he was drifting from the person she had known. He spoke of Mrs. Carrington, enough for Diana to understand that the widow had pursued him relentlessly, offering sophisticated companionship that had seemed worldly and exciting. He had thought himself in love until he saw Diana again and remembered what genuine feeling actually was. As he spoke, tears ran silently down Diana's cheeks. When he finished, she found herself confessing things she had never intended to reveal, how she had refused 3 proposals because none of those men could erase his memory, how she had learned Latin properly in the hope that one day they might discuss Virgil together again, how she had ridden every morning past the oak tree where they had carved their initials. Thomas reached out, his fingers barely brushing her gloved hand, a touch so light it might have been accidental yet, which sent lightning through her entire being. He told her then that he loved her, had probably loved her since they were children, but had been too young and foolish to recognize it. He knew it was impossible, that his father would never countenance a match with a merchant's daughter, that society would condemn them both, but he needed her to know the truth. Their moment was interrupted by Mr. Hartley appearing on the terrace, clearly seeking her out. Thomas rose immediately, reverting to formal courtesy, and excused himself, leaving Diana to endure the vicar's concerned inquiries and transparent warnings about forming attachments above one's station. The following fortnight passed in a haze of stolen moments and cautious hope. Thomas called at Rosewood Manor with increasing frequency, always with plausible excuses. Each visit brought them together, and though they were never alone as on the terrace, their every interaction crackled with unspoken feeling. It was during this delicate period that disaster struck in the form of a letter edged in black. The Duke's sister, Lady Constance Fielding, had died suddenly in Bath, and the family was thrown into immediate mourning. The Duke departed for Bath to handle arrangements, leaving Thomas to manage the estate. All social engagements ceased. The great house was shrouded in black crape, and the family withdrew from society. Yet on the third day of the Duke's absence, as Diana walked in the village on an errand for her mother, she encountered Thomas's curricle outside the posting inn. What froze her blood was the sight of Mrs. Carrington's unmistakable figure emerging from the inn's private parlor, Thomas following close behind. The widow was dressed in half-mourning lavender that somehow made her beauty more striking. She placed a gloved hand on Thomas's arm with obvious familiarity, leaning close to whisper something that made him shake his head violently. They had not yet noticed Diana, who stood frozen beside the milliner's shop, her basket dropping unheeded from nerveless fingers. The dull sound of apples rolling across the cobblestones, the only physical evidence of her silent shock. When Thomas did see her, his face underwent a transformation of horror. He started toward her, but Mrs. Carrington's grip tightened, and she spoke again more urgently. Whatever she said made Thomas stop, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Diana did not wait to see more. She turned and walked rapidly away, ignoring Thomas's call, ignoring the curious stares of villagers. She walked until she reached the small copse beyond the village, where she could finally allow the tears to fall. The betrayal seemed complete. He had told her he loved her, had made her believe they might overcome the obstacles of birth and station, and all the while, he had been continuing his liaison with that creature. The fact that he had met her secretly, during his father's absence and while in mourning, only made it worse. When she finally returned to Rosewood Manor, she found it in uproar. Thomas had called in her absence, had waited for nearly an hour despite her mother's hints. He had left a letter, which her mother had placed on Diana's writing desk with a troubled expression. The letter was lengthy and desperate. Thomas explained that Mrs. Carrington had arrived unexpectedly, claiming urgent news that could not wait. She had information that affected not just him, but his entire family. She had demanded a private interview, threatening to make public certain facts that would destroy the reputation of someone innocent if he refused. He begged Diana to trust him, to give him time to resolve the situation. He swore that whatever hold Mrs. Carrington believed she had over him would be broken, but he needed to proceed carefully to protect those who did not deserve to suffer for his past mistakes. He asked her to meet him at the old oak tree at dawn the following day, where he would explain everything. Diana read the letter 3 times, her emotions cycling through anger, hope, and despair. Part of her wanted to believe him, but the larger part, the part that had learned caution through years of hopeless longing, whispered that she was being a fool. She did not go to the oak tree at dawn. Instead, she watched from her window as Thomas waited there for 2 hours, his figure growing increasingly dejected as the sun climbed higher. When he finally left, his shoulders were bowed in utter defeat. Later that day, Mrs. Rosewood informed her daughter that they had received an invitation to dine at Fairfax Hall. The dinner was an ordeal. Mrs. Fairfax, with barely concealed excitement, revealed that Lord Thomas had been seen entering a certain establishment in Covent Garden during his last visit to London, an establishment no gentleman would visit for any respectable purpose. Mrs. Carrington had been observed leaving the same establishment not an hour later. Miss Hartley added that she had heard from her cousin in London that Lord Thomas had been quite wild during his time there, gambling deep and keeping company with women of questionable virtue. The fact that he had brought his London habits back to Devonshire, meeting with such women during family mourning, showed deplorable character. Diana sat through this character assassination in silence, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails left crescents in her palms. She wanted to defend Thomas, but what defense could she offer? Mr. Hartley chose that moment to approach her with his proposal. He understood her affections might be engaged elsewhere, but his offer remained open. He would be a faithful husband, would never cause her public embarrassment, and would treat her with respect. He did not demand an immediate answer, but asked her to consider whether security and respectability might not be preferable to passion that could only lead to ruin. The Duke returned from Bath 5 days later, bringing with him an atmosphere of even deeper mourning and, unexpectedly, a cousin whom no one had seen for years. Mr. James Montrose was a thin, nervous man of perhaps 30 years who had been living in reduced circumstances in Bath, apparently dependent on Lady Fielding's charity. What no one expected was for this seemingly insignificant cousin to become the catalyst for extraordinary revelations. The exact details were muddled, but the essence of the confrontation, which Diana would later hear from a terrified parlour-maid, was clear. His Grace's voice, usually a measured baritone, had thundered through the walls with unprecedented fury. The Duke had been heard to declare that Thomas would allow their family to be held hostage by a woman of that stamp, all to protect that penniless relation with no sense of honor, to which Thomas had responded, his own voice tight with rage, that James might lack honor, but he was of their blood, and he would not see him hanged for past mistakes. The argument had ended with Thomas storming from the house, mounting his horse, and riding off at a dangerous pace. The truth emerged gradually. Mr. James Montrose had fallen desperately in love with an actress while in Bath. Lady Fielding had discovered the attachment and attempted to separate them. In desperation, James had forged his aunt's signature on a draft for a substantial sum, planning to elope to the continent. The forgery had been discovered, but Lady Fielding, unwilling to see her nephew prosecuted and the family name dragged through the courts, had covered the theft with her own funds. The shock and betrayal, combined with her fragile health, had contributed to her sudden decline. On her deathbed, she had confessed everything to the Duke, making him promise to care for James despite his transgression. But there was more. Mrs. Carrington had learned of the forgery through connections in Bath. She had proof, documents that Lady Fielding had foolishly not destroyed, and she had been using this knowledge to blackmail Thomas. Not for money, but for his continued association, which gave her social cachet that her birth and reputation could never achieve. She had threatened that if Thomas did not maintain at least the appearance of their former intimacy, she would expose James's crime. Forgery was a hanging offense, and even if James escaped the noose, the scandal would destroy the family. The Duke's position in the House of Lords, Thomas's prospects, even the marriages of distant cousins would all be affected. This was why Thomas had met with her secretly. He had been trying to negotiate, to find some way to protect his worthless cousin without sacrificing his own happiness. But Mrs. Carrington had been immovable. The Duke, upon learning all this, had demanded that Thomas cut all connection with Mrs. Carrington immediately, stating they would weather the scandal rather than submit to continued blackmail. But Thomas had argued that James did not deserve to hang for a crime of passion. It was Mrs. Rosewood, of all people, who provided the solution. She had been visiting the Abbey to deliver preserves when she encountered James weeping in the garden. Taking pity on him, she had listened to his tale and then suggested a brilliant course of action. James would publicly confess to the forgery, but with a crucial alteration. He would claim he had taken the money not for personal gain, but to pay debts incurred while nursing a sick friend, a fellow soldier who had saved his life in the Peninsula Wars. Lady Fielding's charity in covering the debt would be seen as Christian forgiveness rather than family shame. More importantly, Mrs. Rosewood had connections in trade that could prove invaluable. Her husband's partner in Liverpool had interests in America and could arrange for James to take a position there, far from England's judgment. The actress, if she truly loved him, could follow. The plan was put into motion with remarkable efficiency, though its implementation was a race against time. Mr. Rosewood dispatched 3 express messengers to Liverpool, while Mrs. Rosewood used all her considerable persuasion to convince James's future bride that America offered more than exile. For 2 tense days, everyone's fate seemed to hang on the return of a messenger and the discretion of a ship's captain. James made his confession in a letter to the Times, crafted to evoke sympathy rather than condemnation. Within a week, James was on a packet ship to New York, his actress bride beside him, having been married quietly in a ceremony the family did not acknowledge but did not prevent. Mrs. Carrington, deprived of her weapon, made one last attempt to salvage her position. She appeared at the Abbey uninvited, creating a scene that would be discussed for years. She accused Thomas of leading her on, of making promises he had not kept, of ruining her reputation. Thomas's response was delivered with cold civility. He informed her that any promises made had been under duress, that their association had been a mistake from the beginning, and that if she attempted any further contact with him or his family, he would ensure that every door in society was closed to her. She left Devonshire that very day, and if she made good on any of her threats, no word of it ever reached the county. But the damage to Thomas and Diana's relationship seemed irreparable. She had not gone to meet him when he asked, had believed the worst of him when gossip painted him black. He had not trusted her with the truth, had chosen family honor over transparency with the woman he claimed to love. Thomas threw himself into estate work with a dedication that worried his father. He rose before dawn, retired well after dark, and spoke to no one beyond what business required. He did not call at Rosewood Manor, did not attend any social functions, and when encountered in the village, was courteous but distant to all. Diana found herself in an impossible position. Mr. Hartley's proposal still stood, and her parents, while not pressing her, made it clear that they considered it an excellent match. Yet every time she tried to accept what logic dictated, her heart rebelled. It was October when everything changed, the leaves turning gold and crimson like nature's own dramatic backdrop. The harvest had been brought in, and the traditional harvest home celebration at Westmore Abbey could not be avoided without giving grave offense to the tenants and workers. The Duke, still in mourning but understanding his duties, had decreed that the celebration would go forward, though somewhat subdued. There would be dancing in the great barn, ale and cider flowing freely, and the traditional feast that brought together all levels of society in temporary suspension of the usual hierarchies. Diana attended with her parents, wearing a simple dress of brown wool that suited the rustic occasion. She had made up her mind to accept Mr. Hartley that evening. She could not continue in this limbo indefinitely. Her mother had noticed her daughter's resolution and pressed her hand in silent support, though her eyes suggested she was not entirely convinced this was the right course. The barn had been transformed with corn dollies and autumn garlands, lanterns hanging from the rafters, casting warm light over the assembled company. Thomas stood at the far end with his father, fulfilling their duty as hosts with mechanical precision. He looked haggard, older than his 24 years, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he had been sleeping as poorly as she had. When their eyes met across the crowded space, the impact was like a physical blow. He started toward her, then stopped, his jaw tightening as he visibly forced himself to remain where he was. The dancing began, and Diana found herself partnered with Mr. Hartley for the opening set. He was attentive and proper, but she could not focus on him. Every nerve in her body was aware of Thomas. It was during the third dance, when partners were switched according to the pattern, that fate intervened. The movement brought her face to face with Thomas, their hands meeting in the prescribed hold. The shock of contact, even through gloves, was electric. For a moment, neither moved. Then Thomas broke protocol entirely. Instead of completing the figure, he kept hold of her hand and led her from the dance floor, through the crowd of surprised onlookers, out into the crisp autumn night. Diana could hear the whispers rising behind them, but did not pull away. He led her to the walled garden behind the barn, where espaliered pear trees created geometric patterns against the stone, and the moon provided silver illumination. There, finally, he released her hand and turned to face her, his expression agonized. He told her everything then, not just about Mrs. Carrington and James, but about his fears, his doubts, his struggle to balance duty and desire. He explained that he had not told her the truth initially because he had been ashamed, not wanting her to see how weak he had been in London, how easily he had been ensnared. He had wanted to be the hero of her childhood memories, not the flawed man he had become. When he finished speaking, Diana found her own voice. She told him of the agony of loving someone above her station, of knowing that every social rule stood against them. She spoke of her jealousy of Mrs. Carrington, not just for the claim she had on his past, but for her beauty, her sophistication, her ability to move in his world with ease. She confessed her own cowardice in not meeting him when he asked, her readiness to believe the worst because it seemed easier than hoping for the impossible. They stood there in the moonlit garden, two people who had loved each other in various ways for most of their lives, finally seeing each other clearly, not as idealized figures of memory or imagination, but as flawed, complex individuals who had made mistakes and suffered for them. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew something that caught the moonlight, a ring, simple and elegant, with a single sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. It had been his mother's, he said, not part of the ducal jewels, but her personal property, left to him to give to his bride. He had carried it with him since the day he had first asked her to meet him at the oak tree, hoping for an opportunity that had never come. Then, in defiance of every social convention, the heir to a dukedom knelt in the damp grass before a merchant's daughter and asked her to marry him. Not someday, when they had navigated the social obstacles, not conditionally, based on his father's approval, but immediately, completely, irrevocably. Before Diana could answer, another voice cut through the night. The Duke of Westmore stood at the garden gate, his expression unreadable in the shadows. He had followed them, had heard everything. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other, the tension crackling between them. Then the Duke did something unprecedented. He walked forward, helped his son to his feet, and turned to Diana with a slight bow. He said that he had been a fool, allowing pride and convention to blind him to what was truly valuable. He had watched his son dying by degrees since the summer, had seen a vibrant young man turn into a shadow, all for the sake of propriety. He spoke of his own marriage, arranged for dynastic purposes, which had nonetheless become a love match. His duchess had been considered beneath him. Her father had been in trade before acquiring his title, and society had whispered for years. But she had made him happier than any blue-blooded bride could have, had given him a son who, despite recent troubles, was fundamentally good and honorable. Turning his gaze directly to Diana, the Duke's voice softened with unexpected warmth. His duchess, he said, had possessed a spine of steel and the good sense of a merchant, qualities he recognized in Miss Rosewood herself. His son, it seemed, had made a wiser choice than he had given him credit for, choosing not merely beauty or accomplishment, but strength of character that would serve a future duchess well. The Duke gave his blessing with characteristic formality, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. He suggested they marry by special license within the week, spending their honeymoon at the family's estate in Scotland, far from society's prying eyes. By the time they returned, the scandal would have died down, replaced by some new gossip, and eventually, even the highest sticklers would have to accept the match or risk offending a duke. Diana, overwhelmed, could only nod her acceptance, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thomas placed the ring on her finger with shaking hands. Then, with his father standing witness, kissed her with all the pent-up longing of years of separation and months of misunderstanding. When they returned to the barn, hand in hand, with the Duke himself escorting them, the reaction was everything one might expect. Shock, delight, disapproval, and excitement rippled through the crowd in waves. Mrs. Fairfax looked as though she might faint from the sheer drama of it all, while Mr. Hartley, to his credit, merely bowed and offered his congratulations with genuine grace. Mrs. Rosewood, practical as always, immediately began planning the wedding with the Duke, their collaboration a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just months before. Mr. Rosewood, shocked but pleased, shook Thomas's hand with enthusiasm and muttered something about agricultural improvements that could now proceed without impediment. The wedding took place 6 days later in the chapel at Westmore Abbey, attended only by immediate family and the closest friends. Diana wore a gown of cream silk that had been her mother-in-law's, hastily altered, but perfect in its elegant simplicity. Thomas looked at her throughout the ceremony as though she might disappear if he glanced away, his joy so transparent that even the stuffy old vicar was moved to smile. They left that afternoon for Scotland, traveling in the Duke's own coach with his blessing and a purse generous enough to ensure every comfort. As the English countryside gave way to Scottish moors, Diana reflected on the strange paths that love could take. From childhood affection, through separation and misunderstanding, past jealousy and mistrust, to arrive at a happiness more complete for having been tested. Thomas, reading her thoughts in that way he had always possessed, took her hand and brought it to his lips. He promised that while he could not change the past, his mistakes in London, his entanglement with Mrs. Carrington, his failure to trust her with the truth, he would spend every day of their future proving that she had not been wrong to forgive him. Their life together would not be without challenges. Society's memory was long, and there would always be those who whispered about the merchant's daughter who had caught a duke's heir. There would be times when Diana felt out of place in the rarefied world of the ton. Times when Thomas would have to defend his choice to those who thought they knew better. But in the important ways, they were perfectly matched. Their childhood friendship had created a foundation of genuine affection and shared values that no amount of social pressure could shake. Thomas found in Diana not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who could discuss estate management as easily as poetry, who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of the position she had married into. Diana found in Thomas not the perfect hero of her girlish dreams, but something better, a man who had faced his failures and emerged stronger, who loved her not despite her origins, but because everything about her, including where she came from, had made her who she was. They would have children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, who would grow up with the best of both worlds, the privilege of their father's position and the practical wisdom of their mother's background. The eldest would inherit the dukedom eventually, but he would be a different kind of duke, one who understood that worth was not determined by birth alone. Their legacy would ripple outward, touching lives in ways they could never have anticipated. As for those whose paths had crossed theirs during that tumultuous year, their fates varied as widely as their characters. Mr. Hartley, though initially disappointed, found unexpected happiness when he married his distant cousin, Miss Emily Hartley, a quiet young woman whose genuine devotion to parish work matched his own. Their union, if less dramatic than Thomas and Diana's, proved no less contented, and they would raise 6 children in the vicarage with love and modest prosperity. Mrs. Carrington disappeared into the salons of Paris, where her particular brand of beauty and ruthlessness found a more appreciative audience. She would occasionally send letters to mutual acquaintances, hinting at exotic adventures and titled lovers. But whether any of it was true or merely the fantasies of a woman who had gambled for the highest stakes and lost, no one could say with certainty. Mr. James Montrose, surprisingly, thrived in America, where his theatrical wife became a celebrated figure on the New York stage. Free from the weight of English expectations and family shame, he discovered a talent for business he never knew he possessed. He would send grateful letters to Thomas and Diana yearly, always at Christmas, describing a life that was perhaps not what he had imagined, but was honest and free in a way that England could never have offered him. His success would eventually allow him to repay every penny his aunt had covered, though by then such gestures mattered more for his own peace of mind than any practical purpose. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. In the end, it was not birth or wealth or position that mattered, but the simple truth that 2 souls, having found each other in childhood, had refused to let go despite all the forces arrayed against them. The boy who had shared his Latin lessons with a merchant's daughter and the girl who had loved him before she knew what love meant had come full circle, their ending a beginning, their separation making their union all the sweeter for the suffering that had preceded it. In the Devonshire countryside, where their story had begun, the old oak tree still stands, their initials now grown deep into the bark, a testament to a love that endured despite everything. And if sometimes lovers meet there in the moonlight, sharing their own hopes and dreams, perhaps they draw courage from knowing that once, against all odds, love conquered even the rigid rules of Regency society. For the heart, when true, knows no boundaries. It recognizes only its equal,